Beloved, as I peered over the Tijuana River Bridge on Tuesday, finding the river in reality to be a small, nearly still stream, with only enough water to fill what looks like a shallow concrete ditch. I looked in near disbelief as just a mere 36 hours earlier, nations were in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of this river, whose controls had been opened, transformed from a small, still stream to a raging river of raw sewage, meant to discourage the movement of asylum seekers who, in an act of pure desperation, attempted to wash tear gas with this polluted water from the eyes of small, innocent children. So I walked down what was the equivalent of Skid Row, passing gentleman club after gentleman club, and extra rows of dilapidated houses situated sideways to shoddy storefronts and busted up sidewalks. I wondered why anyone would find themselves here on purpose. As I walked through what seemed like the valley of the shadow of death, rushing into scores of heavily armed officers, chests strapped with assault rifles, their faces covered with cloths and eyes shielded by sunglasses, I wondered if I was in a war zone. As I approached the open-air stadium where thousands were crammed inside, as I walked among those who spilled outside its gates, who only had a tree for a tent, the sky for their sheets, and piles of their belongings for their pillows. As people lined up for the daily distribution of food and water, I wondered what it was that made them come to this place and to stay in this place, where a line and an illegal ticket system to process asylum seekers had formed. Some waiting in these unsatisfactory, unsanitary, and unsafe conditions for what now has become over 50 days. I wondered, church family, what made them leave their homes. I wondered what made them quit their jobs. I wondered what made them leave their loved ones. I wondered what it was that they saw back in their homeland. I wondered what it was that they had heard back there. I wondered what it was that they had felt. I wondered what it was that they had experienced that made them willing to leave their lives as they knew it behind, to travel thousands of miles across rough terrain on foot, on the tops of semi-trucks, in buses, subjecting themselves to the goodwill of persons willing to pick up hitchhikers. To stay in this place that my feeble verbal description does not adequately convey, with no clear future or security in sight on this first Sunday of Advent. Jesus tells us not to look over to the barn in Bethlehem just yet. Jesus tells us not to coo at the Christmas-born Christ child just yet. But Jesus instead in our text draws our attention to the world around us, both to nature and to people. Jesus says in this text today, when his advent shall dawn, when he returns, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. Men will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. See, church family, Jesus tells us to look at what is happening around us. Tells us to see what's happening in nature, to see how people are living, to see the instability, insecurity, and incivility in which people are existing. Jesus tells us to see the uncertainty of life, to see the disasters that befall us, to see the terror that grips folks' minds, to see the despair that tears apart folks' souls. Jesus says This first Sunday of Advent. Don't look at me just yet. But look at all of that. That just puts us in the Christmas spirit now. When you see that, Jesus says at that time, not only will you see misery, not only will you see hardship, not only will you see suffering, but you will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Hold up, wait a minute, pause. Let's sit right there. Jesus tells us that it's in that moment, when we see all of that going on, when we see all of this going on, that it's then we will see His coming in a cloud with power and great glory. What a paradox this presents for us, church family. Jesus says that in the midst of suffering, there will be my glory. Jesus says that in the midst of confusion, there will be my power. Jesus says that in the midst of your despair, there will be my hope. At least to my own, this makes no sense to our natural minds. But isn't it so, church family, that we are always living in a set of paradoxes? As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, and the testimonies of our lives bear witness to, we are hard-pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but we are not in despair. We are persecuted, but we are not forsaken. We are struck down, but not destroyed. In the midst of the storms of life, in the midst of the vicissitudes of our fortune, in the midst of ebbs and flows, the good, the bad, the ugly, the holy, and the unholy, through the promise of Christ coming down to a manger, up from the grave, here at the table, and back to the skies. The message of this first Sunday of Advent is this: through the hell that is here on earth, we can still hold on to a heavenly home. Even as this is true, as we live between the yet and the not yet, the question for us to wrestle with is, how then do we hold on to hope? Child of God, look at the text. Jesus says, when you see all of these things happening, when you see the Son of Man coming in a cloud, when these things begin to take place, Jesus says, stand up. In order to hold on to hope, beloved, the first thing that we must do is we must stand in our situation. Jesus says, stand up. So your Bibles may read that Jesus says, look up. And that word there, anakuto, literally means to raise or lift one's body. The last time we see this word used in Luke is in chapter 13. Jesus heals a woman who had been bent over, who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. The text there reads in her diagnosis that she could in no wise lift up herself. The Bible reports then that when Jesus saw her, he called to her and said unto her, woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. The Bible says that Jesus laid his hands on her and immediately she stood up straight. Letting us know that even in the worst years long of situations that have us bent over and crippled and looking down in defeat and despair all the time, Jesus has the power not only to heal us, but to straighten us out and to make us stand. This, church family, is what Jesus is calling us to do as we wrestle with how to hold on to hope. We have to learn how to stand in our situations. We have to learn how to stand when we we see the signs in the sun, moon, and stars, we have to learn how to stand in our anguish and confusion. We have to learn how to stand when the storms of life are raging and the billows are tossing high. We have to learn how to stand when others around us are, as the text says, fainting from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on in the world. Jesus lets us know that in the midst of what is uncontrollable, though it may not seem like it, we still have control of our sails. And we must stand even when it seems impossible. Beloved, I do not mean to be insensitive. I do not mean to peddle or pull yourself by your own bootstraps ideology. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps. What I am trying to say, beloved, is this, is that you have more power than you realize. You have more strength than what you think you have. You have more courage deep down on the inside of you that can overcome your fear. You, beloved, are never completely powerless. You, beloved, are never completely voiceless. You, beloved, are never completely down and out. At the end of the day, beloved, you have three witnesses on the earth. You have the Spirit, the water, and the blood. You have three witnesses in heaven: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And if that won't do, you have three witnesses in yourself: me, myself, and I. I came to remind somebody today that with God, all things are possible. With God, you are more than a conqueror. With God, you are an overcomer. And the last time I checked, God plus one still equals a majority. God can do anything but fail. As a matter of fact, the Bible that I read tells me that He is able to do exceedingly, abundantly, above all that we ask or think, according to the power where at work in us. If we are to hold on to hope, we must not only stand in our situation, but we must secondly shift with the signs. Jesus says, when you see these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your head. Yes. That word there, empyro, figuratively means to lift oneself up with pride. Yes. To exalt oneself. See, that first command of Jesus to stand up or to look up, that refers to an outward action that we must take. This second command of Jesus to lift up, that refers to an inward shift that we must make. It's not enough just to stand up, but we've got to shift with the signs. We've got to shift our perspective. We've got to do it even when our reality doesn't shift. We've got to do it even when the signs around us don't stop coming. Notice here in the text that the signs in the sun, moon, and stars don't stop. Notice here that the anguish and perplexity of the nations at the roaring and tossing of the sea doesn't stop. Notice here that the folks don't stop fainting from terror or being apprehensive of what is coming on the world. It only stops when the Son of Man comes on a cloud. Jesus says, when you see the signs, stand. When you see the signs, lift up. Not when you see the Son of Man coming on a cloud with power and great glory. Because it's easy to stand up and lift up then. It's easy to stand up and lift up when you can see Jesus coming through for you. It's easy to stand up and lift up when you can see your way out. But Jesus says, stand up, lift up, shift when you see the signs. Be clear, beloved, this is no silly or secular optimism. This is no happy-go-lucky theology. The signs are an indication of a deeper and higher reality of work. There is something else going on that does not register with the natural eye. As one commentator put it, there is another kind of assurance. that staggers to its feet at the very moment when the world is at its worst. There is something God has done that can change the climate of human history. You see, church family, there is a barometer on the inside of us that we must pay attention to, that we must respond to. There is an anchor in our souls to which we must fasten ourselves throughout the storms and the seasons and the shifts of life. There's a hope that we must hold on to. Beloved, at the border, Tijuana this week, in the midst of the deplorable conditions described earlier, it was amazing, a bit jarring to see how our migrant sisters and brothers shifted themselves with the signs, and how they seemed to secure strength from some unseen source. It was amazing in the midst of what looked and felt like a war zone. Somehow, children in that caravan found a deflated soccer ball, started playing in the same streets that those armed guards were standing in. It was amazing that people were still getting engaged and still wanted to get married. And people who had been married but did not have the documents to prove it, we were able to perform their wedding ceremonies there on the streets of Tijuana. Those streets there became a sacred sanctuary. And I have no problem admitting to you today, church family, that I may have shed one thug tear out of my left eye. Somehow in the midst of the effects of overwhelming evil, hate, and violence, God's presence was made known and palpable. God's power was felt there. God's love was shared, and God became real for us on that street. Church family, as an aside right here, if you ever want to find God, if you ever want to feel God, you've got to go to the margins. All throughout the Gospels, that's where Jesus can be found most often. He doesn't spend a lot of time in the synagogues with the saints, but he's out on the streets with the suffering. And if you want to find Jesus, that's where you've got to go. That's what we are called to do as God's people, to stand in solidarity with the suffering, whoever they may be. To stand with the outcast, to stand with the misfit, to stand with the least of these, to stand on the side of the oppressed. That is whom God sided with in the Exodus, that which we just saw in last week's sermon series. That is, after all what Jesus did in his death, for while we were yet sinners, Christ died. Church family, we don't just find him in somebody else's suffering. We can find him, you can find him in your own suffering too. I don't know who needs to hear this morning, but Jesus is there with you. Amen. Jesus is big enough to care about you and everybody else too. Jesus is concerned about you. He knows you from the crown of your head to the sole of your feet. He knows the number of hairs on your head, or in my case, the number of hairs that aren't on my head. He knows all about your struggles. He knows your worries. He knows your tests and your trials. He even knows your mistakes and your character flaws. And he's still there. So you've got to do what he tells you to do, and you've got to look up. You've got to stand up. You've got to lift up your head. You've got to shift with the signs. Don't wait for him to appear. Beloved, in order to hold on to hope, you've got to stand in your situation. You've got to shift with the signs. Thirdly and finally, you've got to see your salvation. Jesus said, when these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. That is what we celebrate during this Advent season. We celebrate how God is always coming to us. We celebrate how God is never too far off. We celebrate that God is near to us. That's what we celebrate during Advent. We don't just prepare for the coming of the Christmas-born Christ child. We don't just get ready for the baby who will be born in a barn over in Bethlehem. We celebrate that aspect of the gospel that we sometimes overlook. Jesus came down 40 and 2 generations. Was born of the virgin named Mary. That Jesus led a sinless life. Performed a ministry of miracles. Preached about a new kingdom, a new heaven, and a new earth. That he was snuck on trumped up charges. That he hung, bled, and died. That he was buried in a marble tomb. And he rose from the dead bright early on the 3rd day. They tell me that he got up with all power in his hands. They tell me that he ascended back unto the Father, that he sent us the Holy Ghost to lead and to guide us and to fill us with power to make us his witnesses in the world. That he gave us this holy ordinance of bread and wine to remember him, to proclaim him until he comes again. That's what we celebrate in this Advent season. We celebrate that Christ has come. We celebrate that Christ is coming. We celebrate that Christ will come again. And church family, that's how you hold on to your hope. Because Jesus Christ, your Lord, is near. Your redemption is near. Your restoration is near. And your renewal is near. I got news to tell you this morning. Jesus is on his way and he's coming back. So trying times are no time to quit. Rough times are no time to quit. Hard times are no time to quit. They're just signs of the time. So do what Jesus told you and just look up, lift up, stand up, and hold on. For help is on the way. God's getting ready to make everything perfect in his time. And y'all might excuse me, but I'm happy on this Advent Sunday. Not just because Jesus is going to fix it now. Not just because Jesus is going to fix it later. But I'm so happy that this earth is not my home. I'm so happy that I'm just a stranger traveling through this barren land. And church, I'm so happy that one glad morning, when this life is over, I'll stick my sword in the sands of time. I'll stack up my hymn books and Bibles, and I'll study war no more. I'm so glad that I'll take flight on the wings of the morning. I'll cross over Jordan's stormy banks.